Somewhere inside your chest, right now, something is either healing or eroding. There is no alarm for it, no warning light. You could run 5 miles this morning, eat a salad for lunch, and still be losing ground on the inside without a single symptom to tell you so. That is the strange, quiet nature of arterial disease. It doesn't announce itself. It negotiates in silence for years, sometimes decades, and by the time it finally speaks, it usually does so all at once, in an emergency room, in an ambulance, in a moment nobody saw coming. So here's the question I want you sitting with for the next few minutes. If your body were changing for the worse right now, would you actually know it? Most people assume they would. They picture heart disease as something loud, chest pain, breathlessness, a collapse in the middle of a grocery store. But cardiologists will tell you something unsettling. The majority of first heart attacks happen in people who had no idea anything was wrong, not because the disease was hiding especially well, but because we've been taught to look for the wrong signs entirely. We watch a number on a lab report and assume that number is the whole story. It isn't. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why and what your arteries are actually responding to every single time you eat. Let's start with a picture, because the biology only makes sense once you can see it. Imagine the inside of a blood vessel as a smooth, glassy tube, flexible, slick, built to let blood glide through with almost no resistance. That's what a healthy artery looks like on the inside. Now imagine that same surface exposed, year after year, to low-grade inflammation, to blood sugar spikes, to oxidative stress the body never quite finishes cleaning up. Slowly, that glassy lining turns rough. Microscopic damage accumulates the way scratches accumulate on a windshield, invisible at first, and then suddenly, unmistakably there. And once a surface is rough, things start sticking to it. That's the beginning of what we call plaque. Here's where most explanations of heart disease stop, and where the real story actually begins. Not all plaque behaves the same way, and confusing the two kinds is probably the single biggest misunderstanding in popular heart health advice. The first kind is old, dense, and calcified. It has been building for years. It narrows the artery gradually, and, this is the counterintuitive part, it's often the more stable of the two. It's not going anywhere fast. The second kind is newer, softer, sometimes so small that standard imaging barely catches it. But underneath its thin, fragile surface sits a core of inflamed, lipid-rich material, and that surface can tear. When it does, your body reacts to it exactly like it would react to a cut. It rushes in clotting factors to seal the wound. Except this wound is inside a blood vessel, and the clot that seals it can block the entire channel in seconds. That is what a heart attack actually is, in the majority of cases. Not a slow strangulation of an artery. A sudden rupture of something small enough that nobody knew it was there. This is why the question, how do I lower my cholesterol, is, frankly, an incomplete question. The more useful question, the one almost nobody asks, is this: how do I keep the plaque I may already be quietly building from ever becoming the unstable kind? Those two goals point toward genuinely different strategies, and understanding the difference changes how you should think about nearly everything on your plate. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Daniel, because his story is a composite of a pattern doctors see more often than you'd expect. Daniel was 41, worked in finance, ran 3 times a week, and had never had an abnormal lab result in his life. On paper, he was the picture of a healthy man. But a routine scan, done almost as an afterthought, showed early soft plaque forming in one of his coronary arteries. No blockage, no symptoms, just an early signal that something in his internal environment had shifted. What happened over the following 4 months is the kind of result his own doctor described as unusually fast. And I want you to hold that thread, because we're going to come back to exactly what changed for him, and why the mechanism behind it matters more than the outcome itself. To understand that mechanism, we need to talk about cholesterol differently than you've probably heard it discussed before. When your doctor mentions LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, most people picture a single villain, a number that simply needs to go down. But LDL particles floating harmlessly in your bloodstream are not, on their own, what builds dangerous plaque. What matters far more is what happens to those particles after they've been circulating for a while, specifically whether they become oxidized. Oxidized LDL is a chemically altered version of a normal molecule, damaged by free radicals generated through inflammation, poor sleep, chronic stress, and dietary patterns that skew toward processed and sugar-heavy foods. And oxidized LDL behaves completely differently inside the artery wall. Your immune system recognizes it as something foreign, sends in cells called macrophages to consume it, and those swollen, cholesterol-laden immune cells become the unstable, inflamed core of exactly the kind of plaque most likely to rupture. In other words, plaque doesn't begin with cholesterol passing by innocently. It begins with cholesterol that has already been chemically damaged and then flagged by your own immune system as a threat. That single distinction, oxidized versus unoxidized, is arguably more predictive of cardiovascular risk than the raw LDL number most people fixate on. Once you understand that, the entire conversation about diet changes shape. It stops being about cutting things out and starts being about what you're actually feeding into that oxidative, inflammatory process and what you're feeding against it. So let's walk through what the research actually shows moves the needle, one piece at a time, and why each one works on a different part of the mechanism we just described. Start with fatty fish: salmon, sardines, mackerel, herring, the kind of fish that shows up again and again in the diets of populations with historically low rates of cardiovascular disease. These fish are dense in a long-chain omega-3 fat called EPA, and EPA does something genuinely specific. It can integrate into the lipid core of soft, unstable plaque and help reinforce the thin cap covering it, making rupture less likely. This isn't a vague, fish is good for you claim. A major clinical trial following high-risk cardiovascular patients found that concentrated EPA supplementation significantly reduced major cardiac events compared to placebo, a result substantial enough that it reshaped clinical guidelines. The dose used in that trial was pharmaceutical grade and higher than what you'd get from dinner, so it's worth being honest about that gap. But the underlying biological mechanism, EPA's anti-inflammatory, plaque-stabilizing action, doesn't switch off just because the source is food instead of a capsule. 2 to 3 servings a week is the range most cardiologists point to, and if fresh salmon isn't accessible or affordable where you live, canned sardines and mackerel deliver comparable omega-3 density for a fraction of the cost, which is worth remembering because in much of the world, those smaller, oilier fish were the everyday choice long before salmon became a wellness trend. Then there's a category most people underestimate almost completely: leafy greens. Not as a side garnish, but as a genuine daily foundation. Arugula, spinach, kale, and Swiss chard are unusually concentrated sources of dietary nitrates, and here's what makes that biologically important. Your body converts those nitrates into nitric oxide, a molecule your arterial lining produces on its own and depends on to stay relaxed, flexible, and open. Nitric oxide production naturally declines with age and with chronic inflammation, and when it drops, arteries stiffen and blood pressure inside them climbs, creating precisely the kind of internal environment where existing soft plaque is more likely to become a problem. This is why a small side salad doesn't really move the needle. The amount matters. A genuinely generous portion, several times a week, functions less like a garnish and more like a quiet daily input your vascular system is chemically built to use. Now consider olive oil, and specifically, why the distinction between refined and extra virgin olive oil is not a marketing detail, but a biochemical one. The fat content of refined and extra virgin olive oil is nearly identical. What differs is a group of plant compounds called polyphenols, which survive only in oil that's been minimally processed, cold-pressed, and protected from heat and light. One of those compounds, oleocanthal, has a genuinely striking property. It acts on the same inflammatory pathway targeted by ibuprofen, not with the same potency, but with a similar biological target, which happens to be exactly the kind of arterial wall inflammation that roughens vessel linings and makes them sticky in the first place. This isn't a fringe claim. A large, well-designed clinical trial following more than 7,000 adults at elevated cardiovascular risk found that a Mediterranean-style diet built around extra virgin olive oil led to substantially fewer major cardiac events compared to a standard low-fat diet. 7,000 participants followed over years in a controlled trial. That's a meaningfully strong signal, not a wellness anecdote. The catch is storage. Oleocanthal degrades with exposure to heat and light, so an oil that's been sitting on a sunny kitchen counter for months has likely lost much of what made it worth choosing in the first place. From there, we move to a food group most people file under dessert rather than medicine, but shouldn't. Berries, and pomegranate alongside them, are dense in polyphenol compounds like anthocyanins and ellagic acid, and these compounds do something specific to the oxidation story we just walked through. They reduce the oxidative load in your bloodstream that allows LDL to become chemically altered in the first place. Remember, plaque doesn't start with plain LDL, it starts with oxidized LDL. So a food that lowers the oxidative pressure your LDL particles are exposed to isn't managing a symptom. It's intervening one step earlier, before the damage that matters even occurs. Early research on pomegranate specifically has shown promising signals for arterial flexibility and blood flow, though that evidence base is still developing and shouldn't be overstated. What is well established is the broader antioxidant effect of regularly eating a generous handful of berries, and frozen berries, worth noting, retain most of their polyphenol content, so the idea that only fresh fruit counts is one more myth worth letting go of. Garlic deserves its own moment, partly because the way most people prepare it accidentally destroys the very thing that makes it useful. When a clove of raw garlic is crushed or finely minced, an enzymatic reaction begins that produces a compound called allicin, and allicin is where garlic's cardiovascular benefit actually lives. But that reaction takes time. If you crush garlic and immediately toss it into a hot pan, or swallow a whole clove without chewing it, you interrupt the process before allicin fully forms. Letting crushed garlic simply sit for 5 to 10 minutes before cooking or eating it allows that reaction to complete, a small, almost invisible habit with a real biochemical payoff. Allicin operates on arterial health through several distinct channels. It directly reduces inflammation along vessel walls. It makes platelets less likely to clump together in ways that predispose toward clotting, and emerging research suggests aged garlic extract may even slow the calcification of existing coronary plaque, though that finding is still preliminary. Practically, this means garlic works best raw or very lightly heated, crushed into a dressing with olive oil and lemon rather than browned in a pan, where much of its benefit is cooked away before you ever taste it. The last piece is almost comically unglamorous: ground flaxseed, a single spoonful stirred over a finished meal. Flaxseed is rich in soluble fiber that forms a gel-like substance in the digestive tract, and that gel binds to bile acids on their way through your system. Because bile acids are made from cholesterol, when they're bound and excreted rather than reabsorbed, your liver has to pull more LDL cholesterol out of your bloodstream to manufacture replacement bile acid. The net effect is genuinely elegant. Less LDL circulating means less LDL available to ever become oxidized in the first place, which loops directly back to the mechanism we spent the first half of this video establishing. Flaxseed also contains plant-based omega-3s and lignans, compounds that have drawn particular research interest for cardiovascular benefit in women over 40. The one detail that actually matters for any of this to work: the seed has to be ground. Whole flax seeds have a tough outer hull that mostly survives digestion intact, meaning the nutrients inside never really get absorbed. Pre-ground flaxseed, kept refrigerated to slow oxidation, is the only version that reliably delivers what the whole seed promises on the label. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about, and it's arguably more important than any single ingredient we've covered, because you can do everything right at dinner and still be quietly working against yourself the rest of the day, often without realizing it. The modern grocery store is full of products engineered to look like allies in this story, while functioning more like saboteurs. Flavored yogurt is the clearest example. It's marketed around protein and probiotics, both genuinely true, but flip the container over and the sugar content often rivals a dessert. Sugar drives the exact inflammatory, oxidative processes we've spent this entire video describing, so a healthy yogurt loaded with added sugar can, in aggregate, cancel out real progress elsewhere. Plain, whole-fat yogurt, sweetened yourself with actual fruit, keeps the benefit without smuggling in the cost. Granola bars follow a similar pattern. Real oats, real nuts, genuinely useful ingredients, buried under enough added sugar that the net nutritional signal shifts toward harm rather than help. And fruit juice, even the varieties proudly labeled "no sugar added," deserves particular skepticism, because removing the fiber from fruit while keeping the sugar transforms a genuinely beneficial food into something closer to sugar water, wearing fruit's reputation. The fiber isn't a minor detail you can discard. In this context, the fiber is arguably the entire point. It's what slows sugar absorption and prevents the exact spike that damages arterial linings over time. This is also where psychology quietly enters the picture, and it's worth pausing on, because it explains why some people sustain real change and others don't, even with identical information. Understanding why something works changes your relationship to doing it. Following a rule handed down without explanation, eat more fish, less sugar, creates compliance that erodes the moment life gets stressful or inconvenient. Understanding the actual mechanism, that oxidized LDL, not LDL itself, is what builds dangerous plaque, and that specific foods intervene at specific points in that chain, creates something closer to conviction. And conviction is what survives a birthday party, a bad week, a holiday, in a way that a vague rule about eating healthy rarely does. Which brings us back to Daniel. What changed for him over 16 weeks wasn't any single ingredient, and it would be misleading to suggest a handful of foods alone reversed what imaging had shown. His actual shift involved several things moving together: meaningfully improved sleep, a deliberate reduction in a specific source of chronic stress, and a sustained dietary pattern built around the same principles we've just walked through, followed consistently rather than perfectly. What struck his own doctor wasn't just that his follow-up markers looked different. It was how unsurprised Daniel seemed by the result. He wasn't hoping the changes would work. He understood, at a mechanistic level, why they should, and that understanding is precisely what made the consistency sustainable in the first place. That distinction between hoping and understanding doesn't show up on any lab report, but it may be the most important variable in the entire story. Here's what I'd like you to carry away from all of this, because it's bigger than any single food we've discussed. Every meal you eat is, in a very real sense, an instruction to your arteries. Not a dramatic one, not one you'll feel that day, but an instruction nonetheless, pushing your internal environment either toward more inflammation and more oxidative damage, or toward less. Omega-3s working to stabilize plaque that may already exist. Nitric oxide keeping vessels flexible enough to handle whatever pressure the day brings. Polyphenols intercepting LDL before it has the chance to become the altered, dangerous version of itself. Fiber quietly reducing how much LDL is even in circulation to begin with. None of these are single, isolated actions. They're small, repeated signals, sent meal after meal, that accumulate over months and years into the kind of internal environment a cardiologist either worries about or doesn't. Your arteries were never designed to hear from you once, in a moment of crisis. They were designed to hear from you daily, quietly, in a language made of ordinary meals, and the question worth sitting with long after this video ends isn't whether you'll eat perfectly. It's whether you understand, clearly enough, what you're actually saying to your own body every time you sit down to eat.